Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History Program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal and I'm your host for the Living History Program. I'm joined by my panelists, Amjad, Hussain and Arif, Ahmad, fellow historians who will hopefully support me in talking about the Middle East, the cradle of civilization, we termed it. This is a 4-part series we've decided to produce for our listeners. Just to give you a little bit of the background for the Middle East, the Middle East is currently one of the most important and yet troubled regions of the world. Apart from its importance as the main provider of energy supplies that keep the whole world going, it is a region that is responsible for so much instability and destruction through military conflicts. It is a region of the world that could decide the future of humanity, for it is said to be the setting for Armageddon, a prophecy on which the Jews, Christians and Muslims agree, a battle that will bring about great destruction. Ironically, the Middle East was also the setting for the rise of civilization, a region that is accepted by almost all historians as the cradle of civilization. In part 1, we covered the rise of Sumer, which is really the dawn of civilization in the Middle East. In part 2, we are going to explore the earliest empires of the Middle East, starting with the Akkadian Empire and also dealing with the Great Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. The Middle East also gave us some of the greatest prophets that we revere in the Abrahamic faiths in particular as well. And then in the following programs, obviously, we will talk more specifically in detail about the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, and then in part 4, the Egyptian Empire. So let me just give a little recap from part 1 of the program. The period 10,000 to 4,000 BC witnessed 3 critical developments: the origin of settled life for human beings, the first farming, and the first cities. About 6,000 years ago, in a few areas of particularly intensive agriculture, the dispersed villages of Neolithic people gave way to more complex societies. These were the first city-states and the first civilizations, and their emergence marks the start of a new phase of human history. The first city-states were based around river valleys and with innovative ways diverting water for irrigation and erecting flood defenses. The populations and cities grew dramatically. The first city-states emerged around 3,500 BC in Mesopotamia, current area of Iraq, and then around 3,100 BC around Egypt, and then around 2,500 BC in India, and followed by China around 1800 BC. We talked in part 1 of the program about the rise of the great cities in Mesopotamia and the Sumerian civilization and its great contributions. So Arif, if you could just quickly take us through the last Sumerian king and what happened to him before we move on to the first real empire that the world saw, the Akkadian Empire.
Yes, just to remind listeners that according to the Sumerian king list, Lugal-Zag-Z, the last Sumerian king, claimed in his inscription that that Enlil, the chief god, gave to him, and I'll quote, all the lands between the upper and the lower seas, that is, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. So although his incursion into the Mediterranean was, in the eyes of some modern scholars, not much more than a successful raiding party, the inscription marks the first time that a Sumerian prince claimed to have reached what was for them the western edge of the world. However, in 2234 BC, Lugal-Zag-Z was defeated and his kingdom was annexed by Sargon of Akkad. According to later Babylonian versions of Sargon's inscriptions, Sargon of Akkad captured Lugal-Zag-Z after destroying the walls of Uruk and led him in a neck stalk to Enlil's temple in Nippur.
So this was the sad end of the last Sumerian king, but a greater king or emperor was to emerge. Amjad, if you could take us through really the foundations of the Akkadian Empire, which historians regard as from 2334 BC to 2154 BC, and in particular talk us through about Sargon the Great, because he was a great historical figure, but also in the biblical terms as well he's referred to as well.
Well, Sargon the Great was the first ruler of Akkadian Empire, known for his conquest, basically for the Sumerian city-states, and he is sometimes identified as the first person in recorded history to rule over an empire. The origins of Sargon and his past life are shrouded in legends, and according to one, he was the secret child of a high priestess who placed him in a basket and cast him off into a river, a story that, according to some scholars, was later utilized for Moses in the Old Testament. There we have it. And according to another Sumerian tradition, Sargon was the son of a gardener who rose to the position of a cupbearer for Urzababa, the king of Kish, which was not a servant position but a high official. Urzababa was defeated by the king of Uruk, who was in turn overtaken by Sargon. Sargon followed that victory by seizing the cities of Ur, Uma and Lagash and established himself as the ruler. Interestingly, the name Sargon is a modern reading of Shah Rukn. The king is legitimate. So, and we still have that word Shah, and Shah Rukn is name of some of the Mughal emperors in India too. So there we have the connection there. So in reality, we do not know the original name of Sargon. It's more of an epithet. And anyhow, usurping power and assuming for himself the title of a king, Sargon went on to conquer southern Mesopotamia and led military expeditions to conquer further east and north. Sargon built the city of Akkad on his base, south of Kish, which became an important center in the Asian world and a prominent port. Akkad was also home to Sargon's army, which is considered the first organized standing army in the history and the earliest use of chariots in warfare.
So he was really the first emperor to have an empire across what we call the Fertile Crescent, really, and have a spread of an empire from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean in the real sense. Arif, to tell us a little bit more.
Yes, so as we mentioned before, shortly after securing Sumer in 2334 BC, Sargon embarked on a series of campaigns to subjugate the entire Fertile Crescent. And according to the Chronicle of Early Kings, a later Babylonian historiographical text, it states as follows: Sargon had neither rival nor equal. His splendor over the lands it diffused. He crossed the sea in the east. In the 11th hour he conquered the western land to its farthest point. He brought it under one authority. He set up his statues there and ferried the west booty across on barges. He stationed his court officials at intervals of 5 double hours and ruled in unity the tribes of the lands. He marched to Kazalu and turned Kazalu into a ruin heap, so that there were not even a perch for a bird left. So despite this, which shows that he was quite ruthless, he seems to have been actually quite a moderate ruler. And according to one of his own descriptions, he let the nations live in peace and cared for them with the waters of contentment. His demeanour was based on control and preservation, which made him a truly great ruler, not only because of his military strength, but also because of his efficient administration. So with great satisfaction and pride, Sargon credits himself with having travelled to the four corners of the earth, having conquered the entire civilized Middle East, and having established the first and most powerful empire of that time. It's justified for him to say that he could make this claim.
It's interesting, with the rise of Akkad, it seems that archaeological research and records start to link up or pick up with shared historical developments that are discussed or presented in the Bible. The Bible refers to Akkad as the great city in Genesis 10, verses 10 to 12. Amjad, do you want to take that through and make the sort of linkages?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting, really. And the quote in Genesis 10, verse 10 is to 12 is that in the quote here is that the beginning of his Nimrod's kingdom was Babel and Iraq and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Out of that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and
Rehoboth.
And
these are ancient names, aren't they? Hard to say. Yeah.
And Kalach and Resen between Nineveh and Kalach, the same in the great city. Nimrod's historical identity is unknown or is debatable, but Nimrod has been identified by some scholars as Sargon of Akkad, and others have compared him with the legendary Gilgamesh, the founder of Uruk that we talked about in the previous program.
It's interesting because both the Bible and the Holy Quran refer to Nimrud and the Prophet Abraham and his dealings with him as well, and the Bible obviously relates to this important figure. The problem is it's difficult to tell exactly who he was, but certainly there was a personality called Nimrod that had these interactions with the prophets, which we will come to later on, Abraham in particular. Sargon ruled for 50 years and his militaristic reign reached to the Persian Gulf, as I said earlier. Sargon was succeeded by two of his sons, Rimush and Manishutush, who consolidated the dynasty's hold on much of Mesopotamia, but they didn't have his charisma and vision. The Akkadian Empire reached its apogee under Naram Sin, circa 2260 to 2223 BC, and there are references to campaigns against powerful states in the north, possibly including Elba, etc. At its greatest extent, the empire reached as far as Anatolia, sort of southern Turkey, inner Iran in the east, Arabia in the south, and the Mediterranean in the east. So it was a vast empire as far as comparisons of that time goes. But of course, there were greater empires to come later on, and we will deal with those. After about 180 years of rule, the Akkadian Empire was brought crashing down. Maybe you could take us through that, Arif, and just take us through the next stages.
Yes, so the
Guthians, I think, were the initial culprits.
Yes, so the Guthians from the Zagros Mountains in Iran, they in turn were driven out by a resurgent summer led by the third dynasty of Ur. This was in the year 2012 BC to 2004 BC, and this established the Neo-Sumerian Empire. The Sumerians managed to subdue their rival Elam, and at the height of their power they controlled the region up to the Mediterranean Sea. However, the Sumerian Renaissance was short-lived, as the Elamites rebelled and brought the Neo-Sumerian Empire to an end by sacking Ur in 2004 BC. So that was the end of the Sumerians. With the fall of the Sumerians...
I mean, this is where a very interesting group of people now, the Semites, come into play. And I want you to take us through that as well, because the remaining history becomes interwoven between religious and archaeological findings. But go on.
Absolutely. So with the fall of the Sumerians, the political center of gravity, it moved to northern Mesopotamia. And as you allude to, a new Semitic group of people, the Amorites, who had previously been frowned upon and excluded from power, were now hungry for power and influence. So the Semitic peoples of the Middle East were now on course to have some of the biggest impacts on the history of the Middle East and the world.
And just to make it clear, the Sumerians were not Semitic. Nobody really knows where they originally came from, but now the Semitic people starting to have an impact in that region. Perhaps Amjad will turn to you to sort of take us through the origins of the Semitic people, etc. Just take us through.
Well, very curious and very interesting. Indeed, the word Semite nowadays is most commonly associated with the Jews or the Israelites, but historically it has been a much wider reference point. According to, for instance, Encyclopedia Britannica, the term came in to include the Arabs, the Akkadians, the Canaanites, Hebrews, and some Ethiopians and Armenian tribes. Mesopotamia, the western coast of the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, the Horn of Africa have all been proposed as possible sites for the prehistoric origins of the Semitic-speaking people, but no single location has been definitively established. Semites, ranging from ancient Akkadians to Hebrews to Arabs, all are linked back to Shem.
I think we covered that in our last program, because Shem becomes Sem, and Semites go, and then the Hamites and Japhites. So we'll probably not cover that in detail. And then this is basically the children and grandchildren of Noah, and how the terms get used. Let's go to what some of the Sumerian texts tell us in relation to these Semite people and the Amorites as well. Amjad.
Yes, basically in the earliest Sumerian texts, all western lands beyond the Euphrates, including the modern Levant, were known as the land of Mar-2 or Amorites. During the last years of the new Sumerian Empire, the Amorites appear as nomadic tribes under chiefs who forced themselves into land they needed to graze their herds, and so were a real nuisance. Some of the Akkadian literature of this era speaks despairingly of the Amorites and implies that the Akkadians and the Sumerian people of Mesopotamia viewed these nomadics and primitive way of life with disgust and contempt. Maratu, and so one of the clay tabularies, the Maratu who know no grain, the Maratu who know no house, no town, the boars of the mountains, the Maratu who digs up truffles, who does not bend his knees to cultivate the land, who eats raw meat, who has no house during his lifetime, who is not buried after death. So this is one of the
Akkadians basically didn't like them.
Didn't like them, yes.
Didn't like them.
So the term Amorite is also used in the Bible to refer to certain highland mountaineers who inhabited the land of Canaan, described in Genesis, for instance, Genesis 10:16 as descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, who was the son of Noah. They are described as powerful people of great stature and is quoted like the heights of the cedar in Amos 2:9. So who had occupied the land east and west of the Jordan. The term Amorite and Canaanite seem to be used more or less interchangeably, Canaan being more general and Amorite a specific component among the Canaanites who inhabited the land. Since the Amorite language is closely related to better studied Canaanite languages, both being branches of the northwestern Semitic languages as opposed to the southern Semitic languages found in the Arabian Peninsula, they are usually considered native to the region around Syria and Transjordan. The problem with understanding Amorites is that they have two wildly different points of reference, an early Mesopotamian one and a later biblical one, over 1,000-year distance from one another, which seems to have no connection whatsoever except the name.
I think clearly the biblical narrations, let's be honest, were done from an Israelite point of view. And the Israelites from Moses onwards wanted to differentiate themselves from all the previous Semites. And in particular, they were very disparaging about the Canaanites, who they're slaughtered, and so whatever was written was much later on, and
It's probably biased. Yeah.
biased without a doubt. And there probably will have been some disparaging writing by, no doubt, the Akkadians, etc. But they treated everybody the same. Whereas I think, from a biblical point of view, there have been differing. But interestingly, when we talk about the Amorites, there was a very important king, wasn't there? Hammurabi, who was the first. Hammurabi, who was the first Babylonian king. We'll talk in part 3 of this program about Babylonian Empire, but that was the earliest, and he was an incredible king at that time, who sort of was around circa 1792 BC to 1750. So he was an Amorite king, and again a Semitic tradition. So basically, let's move now to the linkage between some of these emperors and dynasties and regions and great religious figures as well. And we come to the patriarch Abraham. Now, Abraham features as an important figure in both Judeo-Christian traditions and Islamic traditions. But according to some historical sources, they relate him to belong to the Amorites as well. Arif, just take us through the linkages, and then we'll come to see what the Bible says and what some of the literature says.
Yeah, so the historical context is that following the sack of Ur, many of the Amorites gradually merged with the Sumerian population in southern Mesopotamia, thus losing their distinct identity. During this period, one very important Amorite family that had spent much time in Ur made the momentous decision to leave Ur and headed back to their ancestral lands, first to Haran and then to Canaan in the Levant. This family belonged to the patriarchal figure of Abraham, who was destined to become one of the most important and influential figures in all of history. The world's three largest monotheistic religions, that's Christianity, Judaism and Islam, they all found their beginnings with him. And currently over 3 billion people in the modern world cite Abraham as the father of their religion. As with most great religious figures, the relevant religious texts, the Bible and the Holy Quran, give an extensive insight into the life and the times of Abraham. But the historical records from the great civilizations are virtually empty. And even archaeologists have no real evidence of where or when Abraham was born or where he lived. However, there is an acknowledgement that he may have lived in Ur between 2300 BC to 1960 BC.
One of the problems with archaeological and historical written records is that they are written by the victors. And the great figures of the time, who tend to be the kings, emperors, and the great priests. And they would not look kindly upon small religious figureheads, etc. who in their eyes they may be small or irrelevant, etc. And it may well be that Abraham, to him at that stage, was an irrelevant, but yet from a religious point of view was such a major figure. And now, of course, in the 20th and 21st century, whose name is remembered more than anyone else, So this is one of the reasons why the old records probably don't refer to him. Neither did the Romans refer much to Jesus early on, etc. So this is inevitable. But the reality is the religious books do refer to him. So let's recount a little bit then of what the Old Testament says about origins of Abraham and where he was and where he lived. Just take us through that.
Well, according to the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, for instance, that's Genesis 11:26 to 28. At birth, Abraham was named Abram by his father Terah, and the name was changed by God to Abraham much later. The family lived in Ur of the Chaldees, and Terah was the ninth in descendant from the biblical patriarch Noah.
Of course, in the Holy Quran versions, father figure is given as Azar, etc. But there's a whole explanation behind all this, which we can't go into in this program. But let's follow the Old Testament account of the father figure, etc. So sorry, Amjad, carry on. I just wanted to interject
not an issue. Yeah. Terah's father, for instance, Nahor, traced his lineage back to Shem, the son of Noah, who gave rise to the Semites. According to Genesis, Terah and many of his ancestors were polytheists. The account is confirmed by the Quran, and Abram's deeply held belief in the one God is given as he tries to persuade his father and other polytheists, including Abraham.
As I said, in the Quran, that father
there's a debate,
is Azar, but it's...
Azar is Azar. Other polytheists, including Abraham, debates with the ruler of Ur. According to the Genesis and the Holy Quran, Abraham migrated with his wife Sarai or Sarah and Lot, the son of Haran.
Because Sarah's name was also changed. It was Sarai initially.
Sarai to Sarah.
As it was Abram, and Abraham's name, according to the Bible, was changed later on. But go on, carry on, sorry.
Basically, from Ur to dwell in the land of Canaan. Canaan. Genesis tells us that it was in Canaan that God gave Abram the new name Abraham, a father of many nations, which means Abraham then received the instructions for the covenant, of which circumcision was to be the sign. Abraham is known as the patriarch of the Israelite people through Isaac, the son born to him and Sarah, and he is also the patriarch of Arabs through his son Ishmael, who was the firstborn of Hagar. The Israelites derived their name from Jacob. Jacob's name was later altered by God as Israel, meaning God's warrior and the son of Isaac.
This is probably a good place to stop now, because we will carry on in part 2 of this program. You've been listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program. Today we are talking about the great prophets, the empires, and of the Middle East. We'll be back with you shortly. Welcome back to part 2 of our series on the Middle East, the Cradle of Civilization. In part 1, we were talking about the rise of the first major empire, the Akkadian Empire, and also the downfall of the Sumerians and the dynasties of Ur, and the rise of the Amorites, which were Semitic people as well, and many of the kings that arose were a Semitic origin, but also some of the prophets. And we were just talking about the legacy of Prophet Ibrahim, as we call him in the Muslim, and we looked at the linkage between the Amorites and the Canaanites, etc. as well. Although we cannot be certain, but it is reasonable to assume that Israelites were distant descendants of the early Amorites, but more and more theological and archaeological research will shed light on that. So let's get back. From a religious point of view, one would call Abraham's migration from a highly civilized and prosperous society in Ur of the Chaldeans. We noted that that's where they lived, Abraham and his family, and they migrated. And to migrate from there to an unknown wilderness, a divine decree, but from a non-religious point of view, one would consider it a moment of madness. In hindsight, only by leaving Ur would Abraham and his little family keep their Amorite identity and Semitic roots, which were so important to subsequent Judeo-Christian and Muslim history, because obviously great empires have the ability to absorb almost all people, all cultures, and unless you have deep roots and deep commitment as a culture, you do lose things. And God has, in his wisdom, has his own plans for keeping his message and his messengers going, and clearly God had decided that Abraham needed to move from there to go to a more holy place. Had Abraham stayed in Sumer, he would have shared in a very different destiny. The family would have eventually merged into a general population so thoroughly that after a few decades it would have been impossible to distinguish from other Sumerians. Arif, just take us through how the Israelites and pre-Israelites saw the relationship with the Amorites and what's stated in books like Deuteronomy and others about this period.
So the Amorites of the Bible, they are depicted as pre-Israelite inhabitants of the land of Canaan, and they're clearly separate from the Israelites. In the book of Deuteronomy, they are described as the last remnants of the giants who once lived on the earth. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11. And in the book of Joshua, they are the enemies of the Israelites who are destroyed by General Joshua. This is in chapter 10, verse 10, and chapter 11, verse 8. So if modern-day scholarship is accurate about the patriarchs of Israel descending from the Amorites, then there must have been some reason why the Israelite scribes went to so much trouble to separate their own identity from that of the Amorites and the Canaanites. The Hebrew Bible also defines the Amorites as one of the populations inhabiting Canaan prior to Israelites' conquest, whose presence was not to be tolerated. So if I just read from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 to 2, it states as follows: "When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land, whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, no show mercy unto them." So when the Israelites sent messengers asking the Amorite king Sihon's permission to pass through his kingdom via the king's road, and vowing not to steal anything from the Amorites on the way, Sihon refused and gathered his army to block Israel. This didn't work. The Israelites summarily defeated Sihon at Jahaz, and his entire territory fell into the Israelite possession. This again is mentioned in Numbers and in Deuteronomy in the Bible. Invading the neighboring King Og's territory, Israel also vanquished the Amorite ruler, capturing 60 fortified cities. And the territory of the 2 defeated Amorite kings now became the inheritance of the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Again, all of these are referenced in the Bible in Numbers and in Deuteronomy. Some commentators think the term Amorites in Genesis may have been used loosely to represent the peoples of Canaan as a whole. Often, Canaan and Canaanite is a geographic designation, whereas Amorite is ethnic. It's explained by Arnold, but they also sometimes overlap with no obvious distinction between them. Each text has to be taken on a case-by-case basis to determine what nuance is intended. So there are similarities, but there are some obvious differences as well.
So clearly you can see from a shared heritage with Abraham and the linkage to the broader Semitic people, and then the Amorites in particular, you can see the separation with the Israelites trying to differentiate themselves from the Canaanites. And really, nowadays, a lot of people talk about that the Muslims and the Quran are violent, etc., and the Prophet of Islam. Well, when you read the accounts of Joshua and what he did to the Canaanites, it makes you shiver in relative terms, the way those people were destroyed and made homeless, and possession of Canaan taken from them. But this is where, prophets rose and empires rose as well. So after the great Akkadian empire, the Amorites played a part in the demise of the Sumerians and the Akkadians, and there was a new center of power, and the early sort of Assyrian Empire, and of course there was the Babylonian Empire. But let's deal first with the rise of the Assyrian, because that was from the city of Ashur, and Babel, of course, gave rise to Babylon as well. But Amjad, take us through first because the Assyrian Empire was an incredible empire, but it had different phases, and we'll go through those not in this program, but in the next one. But just as an early starter, just take us through the rise of Assyrian power.
Well, the Assyrian Empire is considered the greatest of the Mesopotamian empires due to its expanse and the development of bureaucracy and military strategies which allowed it to grow and flourish. The Assyrians were Semitic people who originally spoke and wrote Akkadian before the easier to use Aramaic language became more popular. According to the book of Genesis, the city of Ashur, located on the Tigris-Euphrates river system in the upper Mesopotamia, was founded by a man named Ashur, son of Shem, son of Noah.
So you see, everything goes back to Noah and his sons.
And the great flood, who then went on to found the other important Assyrian cities. The history of Assyrian civilization of Mesopotamia between 2500 BC and 2025 BC is termed as the early period. It is the first of four periods into which the history of the Assyrian civilization is traditionally divided. The other periods, of course, are the Old Assyrian Empire, which is basically 2025 BC to 1338 BC.
1378
1378, sorry, I beg your pardon, BC. The Middle Assyrian Empire is from 1329 BC to 934
1392
BC. To 934 BC, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire is 911 BC to 609 BC. At its peak, the Neo-Assyrian Empire ruled over what the ancient Mesopotamian religion refers to as the four corners of the world. Basically, that was the world for them as far as they were concerned. So as far north as the Caucasus Mountains within the land of what is today called Armenia and Azerbaijan, as far east as the Zagros mountain within the territory of present-day Iran, as far south as the Arabian desert of today's Saudi Arabia, and as far west as the island of Cyprus and the Mediterranean Sea, and even further to the west in Egypt and eastern Libya it is recorded.
Yeah, this was a sort of bird's eye view. In the next part, we're going to cover the Assyrian Empire in a lot more detail. But of course, there was always a competition between the Babylonians and the Assyrians, Arif. If you could take us to the rise of Babylonian power as well. And both these empires had a massive interplay with the Jews, the Israelites, and how they treated them. And of course, we'll come to the Egyptian later on as well. And they also had a great impact on the Israelites as well. But just take us to the rise of Babylonian power.
So yes, you can see there's a lot of competition. And the Babylonian Empire was the most powerful state in the ancient world after the fall of the Assyrian Empire in 612 BC. Babylon, which is derived from Bab-ili, which means the gate of God, was the capital, and the earliest mention of the city can be found in a clay tablet from the reign of Sargon of Akkad, who reigned between 2334 BC to 2279 BC, dating back to the 23rd century. Babylon was merely a religious and cultural centre at this point, and neither an independent state nor a large city. It was often involved in rivalry with the older state of Assyria to the north and Elam to the east in ancient Iran. Now, like Assyria, the Babylon state retained the written Akkadian language, the language of its native populace, for official use, despite its northwest Semitic-speaking Amorite founders and Kassite successors who spoke a language isolate, not being native Mesopotamians.
Yeah, the Jews and the Babylonians had an interesting Nebuchadnezzar's period in particular, which we will cover again in the next program. And then, of course, there was the rise of Egyptian power. Now, that's also as part of the African continent. So people do the African continent a disservice by disassociating Egypt from there. But for our program, I've termed it as part of the Middle East because really the Canaanites and a lot of the Middle Eastern empires had a great interaction with the Egyptians. So and really it is part of the current Middle East as well. So Amjad, just take us through, again it'll be a bird's eye view of the rise of Egyptian power, and in part 4 we will cover that empire in detail because their legacy was quite amazing. But just take us through the main bits. Over the next few
Absolutely,
minutes.
for almost 30 centuries from its unification around 3100 BC to his conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, ancient Egypt was the preeminent civilization in the Mediterranean world. From the Great Pyramids of the Old Kingdom through the military conquest of the New Kingdom, Egypt's majesty has long entranced archaeologists and historians and created a vibrant field of study all of its own called Egyptology. The main sources of information about the ancient Egypt are the many monuments, objects and artifacts that have been recovered from archaeological sites. These are covered with amazing hieroglyphs that have only been recently deciphered. The picture that emerges is of a culture with few equals in beauty of its arts, the accomplishments of its architecture, or the riches of its religious traditions. Egypt has a long history which goes back far beyond the written word, the stories of the gods, or of the monuments which have made the culture famous. Evidence of overgrazing of cattle on the land which is now Sahara Desert has been dated to about 8,000 BC. This evidence, along with artifacts discovered recently, points to a thriving agricultural civilization in the region of that time. As the land was mostly arid even then, hunter-gatherers nomads sought the cool of the water sources of the river Nile Valley and began to settle there sometimes prior to 6000 BC.
Now there's lots of different phases in Egyptian history, so just take us from the earliest dynastic period.
The early dynastic period in Egypt is circa 3150 BC to circa 2613 BC. So the unification of the northern and the southern kingdoms under King Meneses, also known as Mani or Manis, were Upper Egypt, who conquered Lower Egypt in circa 3118 BC, or to some records 3150 BC. He became the first king of the first dynasty.
Egypt is most famous for its pyramids, and it's thought that the age of the pyramid builders was around circa 2686 to 2181 BC. And that's sort of the old kingdom, as they term it. So you've got the early dynastic period, and then the Old Kingdom period around that period. And the dynasty of pharaohs really built the great pyramid of Giza on the outskirts of Cairo, and they built, is it Khufu or
Khufu or Cheops?
Cheops. And the pyramids are later named by classical historians as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world as well. And then, of course, there were other dynasties. Arif, do you want to just quickly break it down for our listeners?
Sure, just briefly. So during the 3rd and 4th dynasties, Egypt enjoyed a golden age of peace and prosperity. But if we just set the sort of timeline, the first intermediate period, which was from circa 2181 to 2040 BC, on the heels of the Old Kingdom's collapse, the 7th and 8th dynasties consisted of a rapid succession of Memphis-based rulers until around 2160 BC. We then move on to the Middle Kingdom, which was known as the 12th dynasty, and this was circa 2040 to circa 1720 BC. During this time, Egypt was reunified and Mentuop of Thebes,
Menhotep.
Menhotep of Thebes, the ruler of the 11th dynasty, and a new era known as the Middle Kingdom began. The Middle Kingdom reached its peak under Amenemhet III, who ruled from 1842 to 1797 BC. The 13th dynasty, which was in the second intermediate period, circa 1720 to 1550 BC, this marked the beginning of another unsettled period in Egyptian history, during which a rapid succession of kings failed to consolidate power. Around 1650 BC, a line of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos took advantage of Egypt's instability to take control.
It is believed that these people came from Canaan, or they had, again, Semitic roots, and in a sense they were the first foreign rulers that took over Egypt, really. Otherwise, Egypt had its unbroken history of...
Patriarch Joseph is probably among them as well.
Yeah. So this is another interesting thing, because often when we look at Egyptian history, we relate to Exodus and Moses and what happened to the Jews, but we mustn't forget, prior to that, the Egyptians also treated Prophet Joseph with a lot of kindness and consideration and gave him such a high place as well. So there are different phases, aren't there, Amjad?
Absolutely. And very interesting, because, now in modern archaeology and with our biblical and Quranic interpretations, obviously Egypt being great civilizations, they're not going to call Joseph by his, by his Israelite name. They will give him Egyptian names.
Yes.
And he will be wearing Egyptian clothes. So when you look for, we might be seeing, because they were really, he was one of the chief ministers.
Oh, absolutely. He reached the very top, didn't he?
Yes, he reached to the top. So, he might have basically a figure, or a statue there. And we might be staring at that in broad daylight, but obviously he's not going to be in the Israelite garbs. He'll be in the Egyptian garbs. Sorry, yeah.
So I think this is just a good overview of the great empires of the Middle East, where you really have an interaction between some of the great empire builders and some of the great prophets as well. We've also retraced how different groups are named as well in relation to the patriarchal figure of Noah as well. I'm just wondering, Amjad, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the new kingdom in terms of Egyptian dynasties, because that was an important period before we finished.
Basically, Amos, the first king of the 18th dynasty, reunited Egypt and initiated what is known as the period of the new kingdom of Egypt. This period once again saw great prosperity in the land under a new and strong central government. The title of the pharaoh for the ruler of Egypt comes from this period of the new kingdom. Early monarchs were simply known as kings. Many of the Egyptian sovereigns, best known today, ruled during this period, and the majesty of the great structures of Egyptian architecture, such as the Ramesseism, Abu of the symbol, the temple of Karnak and Luxor, and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens were either created or greatly enhanced during this period. So basically, during the New Kingdom, military conquest created an Egyptian empire stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates River in Asia. This clashing with other great powers of the area, such as the Mitannians and the Hittites. Within Egypt, imperial expansion was matched by magnificent construction works of tombs and temples. And according to bibliological chronology, the exodus of Moses and the Israelites from Egypt possibly occurred during the reign of Ramesses II.
Yeah, so that's probably the golden period of Egypt as well. And in the Middle East, I haven't covered the Hittites in as much detail, but clearly one of the big competitors for the Egyptians tended to be the Hittites around Anatolia as well. And when we do the program separately on the Egyptians, part 4, that will be, I think. I think we will have a little bit more on the Hittites and their contribution. And they certainly gave a run for their money to the Egyptians. But that's where, again, there was a balance between the Babylonians and Assyrians as well over time, and what Egypt did as well. So I think probably this is probably the right place to stop for this program. In the next program, which will be part 3 of this series, we will talk in a lot more detail about the great Assyrian empires, the rise from the city of Ashur, and also the rise of the Babylonian Empire and the impact they have, and their eventual downfall, because eventually they were swept away by probably one of the greatest empires of the world, which was the empire created by Cyrus the Great. We've touched on that in one of our previous programs. So hope that listeners have enjoyed this program. As I said at the start, the Middle East currently is in turmoil. But we must never forget that the contributions that the Middle East has given the rest of humanity. I know a lot of European historians in particular, they like to go on about the Greeks and the Romans and their contributions, but they picked up and built on the legacy of many of the Middle Eastern empires. And of course, other empires came as well. So I hope listeners will give us feedback as well. Twitter hashtag is at VI Living History. I hope that you will go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and under the programs, listen to the variety of history programs which we've done. It also includes modern history as well, by the way, as well as looking at some of the ideas about origins and languages, and not just empires and emperors as well. So I want to thank Amjad and Arif again for their excellent contributions. And I hope that you will join us for the next program, and then give us some ideas as well of the types of programs that you might want to listen. We will, in due course, be focusing on the Chinese empires of the old, as well as the rise, really, of a giant. China is a giant that's awoken, and it'd be good to cover in our history program something about that, as well as the ancient Indian empires as well. Until then, Assalamu alaikum.